on the other side of change only on the Black Star Network. Before we took a break, we were discussing the LA fires, but also the climate that is happening all across the country, the extreme weather that we're seeing both on the West Coast where I'm at, but also on in the southern side of the state and southern side of the country where Bria is. And I want to talk about disaster capitalism, which you brought up earlier in the show. Disaster capitalism thrives on crises. Landlords will hike up the prices, corporations will buy out and burn down communities, and longtime residents are now displaced, right? They have nowhere to go to be able to rebuild, to recuperate what they lost, or even to find a safe place for their families to sleep. Many of these folks are either sleeping on their loved ones' couches, are finding brief rentals. Some of them are sleeping outside or in their cars. So it is extremely, extremely dangerous times. And one stark example of this is the hands-off, I don't know why. Altadena movement that is happening in California, where families are fighting back about these predatory investors that are coming in, trying to swoop in and take up their properties. What are you hearing from folks?
Yeah, I mean, disaster is big business, unfortunately for us. But yeah, I have a few friends who, my good friend Kimberly Bolton, her family has lost 6 homes in that area because she has a lot of aunts, uncles, parents who are all living in the same community who have done that for safety, who is saying, let's build community with one another, live close to one another. And now we had to all watch our houses burn with one another. And it's really scary. It's heartbreaking, but it's also inspiring because these communities are resisting, they're resilient. It's a reminder that resilience is not just about the rebuild, but about making sure that people know Altadena is ours. You can't take what is rightfully ours. And that has been beautiful. Another person is Blair Imani, who is the creator behind Smarter in Seconds. And she is also a beautiful author. Her family lost some homes there as well. And so they have multiple generations, nieces, nephews, uncles, grandparents, all staying in the same home as they wait for a rebuild, which who knows how long something like that actually takes.
It takes years. I mean, if anyone has ever seen anything built anywhere, right, you have to go through all of these governmental red tapes. You have to, be able to hire the staff to be able to do this. And when you have this much devastation, to your point, we don't know how long it's going to take. I also think it's really important to note that many of the folks, particularly in those Black and brown communities that lost homes, these are people consider even Blair Imani, these are people who are providing services and resources to other people. Like many of them lead organizations and nonprofits that do services to those communities. So those nonprofits and organizations are also feeling the impact of that. And this is not just about housing, right? This sits at the intersection of race, class, climate justice. What happens when rebuilding efforts excludes those people's, those stories and those communities from being able to fully be able to thrive again, especially as they're dealing with these predatory investors that are whispering in their ear, telling them, hey, if an insurance company leaves your state, maybe you should sell. What? That's not how it should. They should have never been allowed to leave in the first place.
1,000,000%. And I think the scariest thing is if that's how bad it is for people who are homeowners who own the land that the house sat on, then imagine for those who are renters who don't own any of their housing, who are at the mercy of the rebuild of the developers and the management buildings who own their spaces, or even for people who depend on these spaces for employment. What happens to farm workers who are picking and growing our food, and we're doing so with masks on because the smoke is still in the air. I mean, they've been giving out these warnings around what the air quality is going to look like for the next several months, because you're not just we think about it. It's yes, people's houses are burning, which means plastic is burning, steel is burning, brick is burning, wood is burning, trash is burning, chemicals are burning, cars were burning. To have to breathe that in, it's scary to understand. Okay, even after people rebuild their homes and have their schools and community spaces rebuilt, their health is going to be affected for much longer than probably is going to be tracked. And I remember this as a New Yorker after 9/11. I mean, people were not breathing right. And there were later suits around the air quality and improper warning for people about how they should be protecting themselves in a state and in a city that just was banning masking.
Literally, I mean, well, in a country that's banning masking, right?
Yeah.
As if all of these diseases and viruses have now evaporated into the thin air. But to your point with not, like, we also have to think about like Katrina, right? This country
Yeah.
continues to never learn its lesson. It
Yeah.
never thinks about infrastructure. And it's so frustrating seeing how much money is just being wasted in our federal government, how much money is being sent outside of the United States to do harm elsewhere. But yet
Yeah.
we lack the desire and the political will to be able to strengthen our infrastructure for the very citizens who put money into into the coffers of the American dollar. I mean,
Yeah.
into the government bank, right?
Yeah, no, 1,000,000%. I'm glad that you brought up Katrina. This moment feels very reminiscent because even in Katrina, like it was that, yes, you have this flooding. And that's the thing about disaster capitalism, because people are sort of like, why are you bringing up race? Why are you bringing up, it's not political. We're all in this together. And it's like, no, the natural disaster comes, and that the natural disaster itself is not racist. It's the response that our government does or does not give that is racist, that is very discriminatory. So in Katrina, it was like, let's break the levees and sacrifice Black residents and their communities and their homes, have them be climate refugees in stadiums while white residents are being flown out as long as you can afford to, right? And like, I think that's what we're seeing here is that when they were evacuating folks, it was at the mercy of you being able to fly out and have somewhere to go. There was no real coordinated response of here is where you go. And we have planes ready to fly people out to safer spaces. And it shouldn't be this way. Like, why are we always the first ones to be deemed collateral damage and the last ones to be protected?
Yeah, I'm trying to stop myself from crying because I just remember the images from Katrina of people like standing on their roofs and on top of cars and like waving signs, and they went days without fresh water, like days in a country that literally has sent people to the moon, right? Like we can't get water and food to folks who are suffering. Reminds me of Kanye West saying, you know, George Bush doesn't like Black people.
That was some of his best work.
The United States government doesn't like Black people.
No, truly. We need that Kanye back because we need truth tellers right now. We need people to say it. And I feel like what's frustrating, I miss the old Kanye straight up. But no, actually, and what's scary is like we have 1 million documentaries and books and exposés and investigative articles explaining just how much the government failed Black people during Hurricane Katrina. We're what, like nearly 20 years out from that. And now we're still facing situations where the same thing is happening. And it's like, at what point do we learn? At what point does it not become entertainment that someone gets to profit off of? It's not a Netflix documentary, but at what point are government officials actually learning how to better protect us?
Yeah. Especially, I mean, let's not forget California, it be eating up the paycheck. Okay. They take those taxes out. Like we pay for that infrastructure, and a lot of things can be true at once, right? Like a lot of things can be true at once. But what we do know is that the devastation also always impacts Black people vastly different, or Black and brown communities vastly different than it does our white counterparts. You mentioned books. I just finished right before the LA fires. If anyone has ever heard of Octavia Butler, phenomenal writer. And for years, I was afraid to read Parable of the Sower. I heard so many stories about it. And to be honest, since COVID, I haven't been able to, what I think is like trauma porn. I'm not saying that about this book, but a lot of like books where the reality is just too hard. I can't consume it. But I read it right before the fires, and I can't tell you how eerie it is to read that book, especially because, Octavia says she's not predicting the future. She is looking at the patterns of the past and making conclusions about what we know to be true. Yeah. Just talked about Katrina, patterns of the past and the lack of government infrastructure or the lack of political will to give a damn about these communities.
Right.
The stage for it to happen again.
Yeah, that's the part. I really appreciate her saying that. Like, I'm not actually predicting the future. I'm just putting our current problems 30 years into the future and saying, what happens if we let them persist? And so the challenge is like, I mean, if y'all were reading the book back then, we could have avoided some of this stuff. Like, I read the book, I read the book last year because the book begins in July 2024. And I was like, you know what? Let me read it on timeline. And it was so eerie and strange to be like, why is so much of this so spot on? Down to there being a president running for office talking about making America great again. And she's bringing that up because that's what Reagan was saying. So it's like we've allowed that to shapeshift and transform and evolve into Donald Trump when we could have nipped it in the bud and cut it at the knees back then. And so it's just frustrating to realize, like, in an ideal world, Octavia Butler would be considered outdated work. Like, oh, that was before Al Gore. That was before we were serious about climate. But we didn't. We got Bush and everything else that comes after that. And it's like, this is what happens when you let the problem persist. So it's definitely
America's a masochist, as far as I'm concerned. We like the pain to the extent that we want to experience it over and over and over and over again, and then look up and be like, well, how did this happen?
Yeah,
it happened because we let it happen. But hopefully this time is different. I mean, we're seeing communities pull themselves together much faster than our government is acting, and I think that is giving me hope, especially at a time where it feels like so much of our country is divided across political lines because of just the hate that is running rampant. Right?
Yeah.
Like if we're honest with ourselves, at the core of the decisions and the political decisions that people are making is rooted in hate. It's rooted in discrimination. It's rooted in racism, and it's playing out across a multitude of ways, including how our government responds to the climate impact. But one thing about climate is that it's eventually going to impact all of us, right? It's no color. It sees no social economic class. You might be able to respond differently after it happens, but when that storm hits, when the fire starts, we're all at the mercy of its natural direction. So
all of us. And so hopefully we learn the lesson that Octavia was trying to teach us, which is that community is the only antidote. We have to keep one another safe. We have to stop thinking about individualism and actually move to a place where we recognize how interdependent we are. So I'm excited to dig into that. And we have a good guest later who we're going to talk to that about. But before we bring him on, let's go to a break again.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
We are back with The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network.
So before we went on break, we were talking about the climate implications that are happening all across the country. And to help us understand this moment from a bird's eye view, we have our friend and colleague, Dorian Paul Blathers, to help us really discuss and get into the nitty gritty of this. Dorian, is not only a handsome man, but he also is very qualified to talk about this issue. He is the former Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and entered this role with a decade of experience of electoral and issue-based campaign politics. Dorian previously served as the Public Engagement Program Officer for a Climate Action Campaign, and he is now the CEO and founder of Good Rebel. Welcome to The Other Side of Change, Dorian.
Thank you for having me. It's good to see you, Jamira and Bria. Thanks for inviting me into this conversation.
Yes, I'm so excited. And I feel like we got a good freckled light-skinned sandwich for you, Jamira, too.
I know. I'm really happy to be in. We appreciate it. Dorian, I was chatting with you during the height of the LA fires. And I say height, it's still going on, unfortunately. But I remember you showing me like the outside of your balcony. Can you tell us a little bit more about like your experience of what is happening, one in LA, but also what is happening regarding climate change in general across the United States, but also the world, right? We just saw the US pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So what are those implications that you're seeing?
Absolutely. It's fascinating that this all just happened 2 weeks ago. I remember the night of the the night that we had that conversation, I was on my balcony, and at this point, the Palisades fire had already been burning. The Eaton fire, where the community of Altadena is, was also burning. But we saw with those extreme wind events, those Santa Ana winds that come in off the mountains, there were literally little fires everywhere, all across Los Angeles County. I live in Thai-Town, which is just on the edge of Hollywood, and a very popular hiking destination that some of your favorite influencers hike all the time caught on fire. And that is right here in the heart of Hollywood. We had a fire situation where nearly 100 acres were burning. But for the first time, I had to consider what it would be like to actually leave my house, to have a go bag packed and ready to go. I could see a small orange glow that began to increase in just a matter of minutes. And funny enough, I was actually hosting friends from other parts of the county that were escaping fire to only have to, evacuate here from Hollywood, and find another place to go for the night. But what I realize is that, like, we are in the climate collapse. So for climate activists and organizers like myself who have been talking about these issues as something that is looming or something that is coming, it is absolutely here, and it's been here, and we're going to see that happen. As you stated earlier, in communities across the country, these extreme weather events are becoming more disastrous. And it's so important to contextualize that it is Black and brown communities that are often hit first and worst. And I'm not just talking about, physical property in space. I'm talking about the impact of the fallout of these disasters. They are, there's certainly loss of life that we're seeing. The highest number of casualties came from Altadena, right? Another historically Black community. But also when we think about, what happens after the fires, there are so many people, thousands of people who are out of work in both the Palisades community and Altadena, right? There are thousands of people who are now displaced and considering what they can do with the $43,000 that they're eligible to receive if they qualify for it when applying through FEMA. That doesn't go very far in California when you've lost your vehicle, you've lost your home, maybe you've lost your job, right? We're still learning about the stories that are happening. And it's important for us to, talk about this in a global context. I'm happy that you raised that, because when we think about who climate refugees are, who folks are who are often on the front lines of just the pollution that causes these disasters, but also the fallout from the extreme weather that climate change exacerbates, it's people that look like us. It's Black people first, right? It's brown people. We look at island communities who are experiencing, hurricanes that are larger than they've ever been. This is something that we're experiencing as a global society. And it's important that we get this right now as we kind of shift from, the long held conversations on mitigation to adaptation. How do we live while these things are going on? And how do we rebuild and have resilient communities that allow us to still live with dignity in these really scary times?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, because especially that global context. People don't think, when they think of the terms climate refugees, that sounds like something in the third world, which I don't even use language like that. But like, that's
we are the third
world, right? We in a Gucci belt. That's us.
That was me 2 weeks ago, right? Like,
we never think it'll be us until it's us, and then you're the one thinking, what do I put in the book bag and what's worth taking? And seeing people like making split-second decisions of, this is the only photo I have of my mother, or this is, my child's memories, or whatever. Like, I can't imagine. I mean, it made me and my wife get really serious about, we have to get our to-go bags ready, because we certainly don't have infrastructure down here if something really hit. And people always think, well, I don't live in a community like that. And that's what a lot of people think until it hits your community. So it's definitely so scary. I mean, when you think of this rebuild, what is just and fair when it comes to rebuilding Altadena with Black and brown residents at the center? What needs to be considered that maybe people are not talking about or are only talking about in little whispers, but not on a mainstream scale?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you all saw that viral Instagram video that went out. There was a young woman named Shelly Bruce, who happens to be a friend of mine, who grew up here in Los Angeles. And she's making, kind of this desperate plea and appeal to all of her followers and everyone who's paying attention around the world on Los Angeles, that like, especially Black folks who she's speaking to, she's like, we are going to make these communities whole again. The Altadena wildfires didn't just destroy homes. It put an entire Black community at risk of permanent displacement. And this is a community that was built on the backs of folks who, were seeking home ownership and economic prosperity because of redlining, right? They were pushed to Altadena and made it a safe haven of activists and artists and professionals who had worked very hard to build this community from the ground up. So when I think about making this community whole, I think first, in any context, it's important for us to allow those communities to first speak for themselves. I was so happy to see, Shelly talk about her family. I was so excited to see, viral, influencers and artists from Altadena, people like the celebrity vocal coach Stevie Mackey, right, who's from Altadena, talk about what his family was going through in that over these past few weeks. But first, I think we're going to have to pause and acknowledge that Altadena will never be the same. Altadena, as it was, will never be like that again. And it's going to be on us to, to steal from a former boss and president to build back better. We're going to have to do that and be mindful of how we first stop, the stem of, we need to stem the predatory practices that are actively kind of lurking and waiting to pounce on the economic opportunity that is an entire Black city that's been erased. The governor has, instituted now a 3-month ban or moratorium on developers being able to offer below market value for these properties. We need to question, is 3 months long enough? People are still trying to find clothes to put on their back, right? People are still looking to, get back in their doctor's office and to get their kids back into school. To think that they are having to also contend with, the vultures, right, which is capitalism, coming to profit off of their pain, is the first thing. And there are a number of different things that I think we can do. You all talked about Katrina earlier this episode. And we know that there are a lot of mishaps for how, the lower Ninth Ward, was rebuilt. But we need to be asking questions about, like, what does a buyback program look like, right? If the state of California or if LA County is able to purchase these properties at, market rate, and then to hold these properties for these families to be able to come back when they have the resources, right? Those are the type of questions and conversations we need to be having, so that we can retain, that safe haven that they've created over, nearly a century.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's being lost in this shuffle right now is this idea that, in addition to the fires, there's the economic implications of the moment, right? We know that last year there was an 18% increase in homelessness across the country. We know that unemployment is on the rise. We know that many tech companies have been laying people off all across California. And for this to happen in the midst of that, as well as we see so much is happening with the tariffs and how that's going to impact more jobs, right? So the fires is one thing, but people's livelihoods across so many different issues are being, like, the pressure is being put on them, and they're not in a place, to your point, to make decisions about the long-term implications of their property, while in the midst of trying to find clothes and food to support their families. It has to be devastating. From what you've seen, I mean, we've talked about this earlier in the show as well, like the community response, like communities are almost showing up much quicker than government agencies and institutions that are supposed to be prepared for devastating moments like this. How do we sustain that kind of momentum long term, knowing that there's probably going to be more devastation that will continue to happen because we're not making the right decisions regarding climate change, especially during an administration that seems almost hostile to even talking about climate change because maybe he thinks it's a part of the DEI strategy. I don't know.
That's right. I think that, while this has been just a tragic couple of weeks for LA and for the country, I've also, as someone who has been in LA for 2 years now, seen the best of who we are. And it's actually young Black millennials that I've seen step up and lead on the recovery and restoration efforts. That has been so inspiring. So, I mentioned Shelley Bruce. She has an organization called the Heart Department. And this organization is literally taking up space in and around in the surrounding communities in Pasadena and Altadena, so that folks can come in and get things like counseling services, so that they can practice in, breath work and movement, right? They're looking at the whole person that's been impacted by this. And then I think of folks like Etienne Maurice with his organization, Walk Good LA, right? Which also has been providing direct services, but taking that a step further and saying, like, we need to make sure that people are whole mentally, socially, and emotionally in this time, because restoration is not going to happen overnight. And us coming together and taking care of one another, the collective, I think in the immediate term is one of the most important things that we can do. And there's been an outpouring of people who have been volunteering and showing up. But in a disaster, in any disaster, there are a few things that we know that we can do. The first thing is to show up, right? So that's volunteering with organizations like the NAACP, right, who are providing advocacy avenues for folks to show up and speak to our representatives here locally and at the federal level. They're also working with attorneys in the legal community and making sure that these families and communities have representation. So showing up, right, is one thing that we can do, using our own labor, our bodies to respond to this. The other thing that we can do is fund it. For those of us that do have resources to donate or to contribute to these organizations, be it dollars or other in-kind resources and services that we can offer, Black and brown organizations that have historically been underfunded are going to be under even greater strain during this disaster. The next thing that I would say we can do is what we're doing right now, which is speaking up and utilizing our platforms to talk about these issues and to educate the public. When the president of the United States spends hours on the other side of town talking to residents in the Palisades, but doesn't mention by name the city of Altadena, which is in LA County, we know that it's incumbent upon us to take our own platforms and to utilize them to do the work. And I know that folks are tired coming out of November, and these last couple of months have felt like a year in and of itself. But for everyone waiting for the cavalry to come in, for the Democrats to come in, for Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or whoever to come in and save the day, my message to folks is that we are the cavalry, and it starts with us. The other piece that I think is important for us to do, so it's showing up, right? It's funding it, it's speaking out, and it's also fighting back. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation percolating online, in mainstream media, coming out of the White House. We've got to call that out. And we also have to roll up our sleeves and decide what part of this elephant we're going to focus on and just be diligent about accountability, about calling out bad actors, and about asking for more, right? So whether that's the governor and extending this moratorium on, the offers that can be delivered to these communities for buying their homes, whether it is Congress, who hasn't done anything yet. I don't know if folks realize this, but there has been no federal aid bill delivered for the state of California yet. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, said that he thinks that there should be conditions placed on the aid. That to me is indicative of where we are, and it starts with us. So speak out, fund it, show up, and fight back. That's where we're at.
Yeah. Oh, we are the cavalry. I want that tattooed on my forehead. That's so real. It's so
yes.
Right there, right?
Waiting for.
No,
we're not coming.
And I think it reminds me too of, to go back to Octavia Butler, but there is a bookstore, Octavia's Bookshelf, in Altadena, very close to Octavia's adult home. And the founder of Octavia's Bookshelf, Nikki High, has also opened up the bookstore to be a refuge. They've been doing mutual aid. They've been housing people. They've been collecting donations and disseminating. And it just reminds me that we can always come together and do the thing that needs to get done faster than the government with red tape. And we have to be the ones doing the thing that needs to get done. So I just really love that you said that. But then you brought up something that's making me a bit nervous, which is we have to be wary of the misinformation and the disinformation, which feels like it's going to be even harder to do when all of the tech CEOs are fleeing from the responsibility to field and moderate that on their platforms. I mean, Zuckerberg, obviously Elon Musk. So it's like, do we stay on these platforms and continue to sound the alarms? Do we need to be doing this outside of the context of these digital spaces? Like, where does digital strategy and digital spreading of information fall into where you see as this need to be speaking truth to power?
That's right. Well, I love, a good newsletter. And there was a point in time when I was on my church's listserv, and they would send out information about any sort of boil water advisory, any public health crisis that was happening in the community, any opportunities, right, for folks to get assistance or resources. I think that we're coming to a point now where we're going to have to give up some of these the tactics that have helped us spread our messages through big tech, through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, and get back to, direct primary source avenues of sharing information. So whether that's email newsletters again, whether that's public meetings and showing up in person, I think that we're going to have to, think about the most basic organizing principles that gave us the freedoms that we have in this country now, in resorting to those efforts where, the algorithm can't impact, what's being said, where we can't be suppressed. And I think that it's a both and approach. I know that, when I think of my aunts and uncles that are on Facebook, I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. But if they heard from me directly, right, as someone who's on the ground, as someone who's seen the fires, as someone who has worked for the federal agencies that are providing some of the aid and response, right, that carries a lot more weight and value than information that folks can't even trust, right, as being credible or viable anymore. I think we've got to return back to those principles.
Yeah, it has to happen on and offline. It's the reminder that for many of us, millennials who are online, chronically online, like I am, we are oftentimes the biggest source of information to our relatives. So anytime we see information, we consume information, we should be asking questions like, why, how, when, is this true? Should I check another source? Because if we're sharing bad information, especially if we have large platforms, we can do more damage than good. And so it's constantly questioning the information we're consuming with the recognition that it's going to be exhausting, right? One of the reasons why our opposition wins so often is that they want to bombard us with so much tragedy and information at the same time, to the point where we don't know how to respond. But you mentioned earlier, Dorian, the idea idea that, any way to tackle an elephant, we have to each choose a side and eat it bit by bit. We can't do it all. There isn't the expectation that we can do it all. But in this work, we can definitely, working in collaboration with folks, we can definitely hit our target. Awesome.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
We are back at the other side of change, only on Black Star Network. And we are all about dreaming beyond limits and putting our finger on the better world that we're actually working towards. And I am so hyped because today we have my boo, Kimone Felix, here with us. Kimone is a brilliant writer and organizer who diagnoses what's wrong with the now and lets us know how much possibility lies in abolition. Her existing book, Dyscalculia, is a favorite of mine. And she has a forthcoming book that we're going to let her tell us all about later. Welcome to the other side of change, Kimone.
Hi, thank you for having me. You're both so brilliant. I can't wait to listen to this podcast.
Oh my God, you, boo, you. We love you. Okay, so Kimone, let's start with just like a little dreaming, because I feel like we have lost our ability to dream outside of the lines, and people can kind of only operate between what they've already seen and like slight tweaks to that, which is again what we're not about. So when you dream of this abolitionist world, paint the picture for what most excites you about how more people will be able to access safety, dignity, and joy.
I think it actually starts with a scenario that you just brought up, right? That you go to the grocery store or you go to the corner store and there's a young person who clearly needs some kind of service, right? Whether they're acting up or they're in crisis, right? And that person, whoever is like running the grocery store, knows who the mom of this child is and knows exactly who to call, when to call them so that this child can be taken care of, right? That is such a radical image because it offers a suggestion that we already know to be true, which is that we have what it takes to take care of each other and to take care of ourselves. And I also think that part of what the dream looks like is being able to redirect some of those funds that we know go to the carceral system into the world that we live in and the world that we want to live in, right? So I want to see schoolhouses that have new books. I want to see unhoused people being offered housing that is sufficient and humanizing. I want people to be able to go to the store and access food that is good for them, that is nurturing and fortifying. Those are some images that come to mind, and some of them feel a little abstract, but I think that's what's so cool about dreaming, right? Is that in some ways, you have to dream in an abstract way to even get close to imagining something that's common, right?
Thank you for sharing that. That's one of the reasons why I follow you online. But I'm reminded of, prior to meeting you, and for those who don't know, Kimone also used to do electoral politics. I'm sure she still dabbles in it a little bit. But we met during her time on the Elizabeth Warren campaign. But I was following you prior to that online and had seen some of your performances. And one of the things that I always thought stood out is your ability to verbalize, really contextualize this idea of imagination, and that I feel like like so much of that has been stolen from us here in the United States of what is possible, like dreaming beyond the traditional limits that society has placed on our minds, right? And our ability to think about something different outside of what we told is possible. And so I'm curious for you, because COVID radicalized me. I'm curious, what was that moment for you that radicalized you, that got you to the point of believing that this new world is possible?
That's a great question. It's hard to identify one moment because I think that my radicalization is a composite, right? Like it came from so many different moments and so many different times. But I have one essay that I wrote for New York Magazine about abolition. And it came from a place of really wishing that my experience with sexual harm was treated differently, right? That the person who caused me harm, that their punishment wasn't to also receive harm. And I think as I started to try to understand, like, what was that anxiety that I was feeling, right? Like, why did I feel so bad that this person who harmed me had to go to prison? And so in trying to navigate that, I started reading, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Cedric Robinson, just really trying to contextualize, like, what is the thing that makes it so hard to reconcile what's happening in our carceral system, right? So I think that's one of the things. But I also say, and Jamira, I know you can relate to a lot of this, like being in electoral politics, like every election cycle, I find myself angrier and angrier and more disillusioned, right? And the thing about disillusionment is that it can become useful or it can become despair, right? Which I don't think is always useful. And so every cycle, the more disappointed I got, the more enraged I felt and the more activated I felt. So in some ways, like all the work that I've been lucky to do has led me to this point of radicalization. But yeah, I mean, there's so much more I could talk about. I started talking about Palestine with my dad when I was 12. And all of those experiences, just really makes up who I am today and the way that I think about power and progress in systems.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that you said that. And that reminds me of the Miriam Kaba quote, let this moment radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. And it's so real. I think it's easy to be only angry, but you don't really get creative from a place of anger, right? Like anger is good for fueling you towards participating in mass action or mobilization, but there's only so far it will get you, and it'll actually burn you out fast. And I remember being in that place after Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Sandra Bland were killed right around like that 2014, 2015 moment. And it was like, I needed to tap into something that made me believe there was another world we could work towards, which is the beautiful thing about abolition. I love that people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis and Derica Purnell can leave you thinking like, wait, it doesn't have to be that way. Like we funnel billions of dollars into this very violent killing machine. What if we didn't, right? Like, so where do you see the abolitionist movement now, whether that be from a comm standpoint and how much people understand it, or like the actual status of implementation?
So I think that the abolition movement is happening, it's sort of existing on all of those planes. It's happening in different ways at the same time. One of the most important things that's happening within the landscape right now is this consciousness raising effort, right? We don't get people to a place of imagination unless we invite them to imagination. And part of how consciousness raising works is bringing people into the space where they're willing to question why things aren't working. And in that space of questioning, are able to receive some answers, not just about why it isn't working, but what might actually work in place of it. And I think with credit to, of course, Derica Purnell and so many and like we said before, Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Orasami Burton, right? We have so many people who are bringing this thinking into the mainstream consciousness. And I think even though to some people that might feel really lofty and again, abstract, like there's so much work to be done in just communicating to people, not just what abolition is, but like why it matters to their everyday lives. You know, yeah. Like people don't imagine that the carceral system exists in their homes, right? They think that it is something that lives only.
They're not ready for that.
Well, they're not ready for that. I know, but like that's part of where we're at, right? Like that's part of where the landscape is now. Is like having those conversations and being like, yeah, you probably didn't think about that, but that thinking has been done already, right? And I also think that abolition is absolutely at the point of implementation, right? I think one of the things, there's an organization called RAP, which is Releasing Aging Prisoners. And they just did an amazing action in Albany a couple of weeks ago. And I learned about them through some organizing work that I do with an organization called WAWAG, which is Writers Against the War on Gaza. And in this room, you have people who are concerned with, you know, geopolitical oppression and people who are concerned with local oppression, of course. And at the intersection is this organization where there are people who participated in the Attica riots, people who have been just doing prison reform and abolition work for a really, really, really long time. And the work that they're doing is not just to change what we think about incarceration, but really working to like get people out of jail, right? Get people out of jail, get people to get the systems, invalidate the system so that the work of getting people out of jail is not about empathy, right? Or decisions that the state makes. It's about like our ability to advocate for ourselves and for our people and to actually be able to build tools that create leverage that get our people out, right? So yeah, I think it's like abolition right now is doing a lot of different things, but I think consciousness raising and implementation through direct action and protest is where we are right now.
No, it's I'm happy you mentioned the consciousness piece, because oftentimes when we think of revolution or abolishment, it's the external, right? What is happening around us. But it first happens in our mind. Like, how do we decouple what the lies we've been told about ourselves, about the world, about people who look like us, about people who don't look like us? I remember the guy who, there's a really great video going around on TikTok of the person who said, you know, the revolution will not be televised because the first revolution will happen is a revolution of the mind, is reconstructing what is happening in our mind and how that has perpetuated our lack of imagination. You know, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of this country, and we know that on average, most empires last about 250 years. If there's ever been a time to reimagine, it is this moment when the country is going through this level of transition.
Absolutely. The empire is for sure falling. And it's during these moments of like extreme crisis that people feel like they have to think differently, right? Yeah. Like when your life and the lives of the people that you love, when everything feels so precarious, you either give up or you imagine what it could be. And it's been very exciting to watch people come to abolition, even though for some people it's like really far off, and that's totally okay. But watching people move from, you know, a place where they say like, well, we need prisons, how are we gonna stop crime, to a place where they're like, oh, we're not even sure if crime is like real, right? Like just asking those questions, which like seem really complicated, but actually like allow us to have conversations that we just otherwise wouldn't have had. Like it never occurred to me to like think about how the idea of a crime is constructed. Like who came up with the idea of crime? What does it mean to commit a crime? Who gets to judge what is a crime or isn't, right? Like we talk about like, you know, crimes of despair, right? Where someone is perhaps like, or crimes of convenience where someone's like deeply in need and they might have to, I don't know, rob a store or rob a corporation in order to get what they need, right? how is it possible that being under-resourced and needing the resource to save your own life, right? How is it possible that in the process of trying to get that resource, that the only thing we can consider is that this person is bad, has done something wrong, and needs to be removed or isolated from their communities because they're hungry, right?
So it doesn't solve the original problem, right? It only perpetuates.
Exactly, right? So even just that question of like, what is a crime gets us so much further in our thinking about how our everyday lives work, right? Like,
yeah. I love that you're saying this. It reminds me, there is this Netflix documentary, or like it's like a dramatized version of a true life story. And it was like one of the first psychologists that was suggesting that police departments do this. And he was doing it from a form of preventing crime and saying, like, if we have an archetype of the kind of person who wants to commit harm against another person, we can better prevent the harm. For example, if you know that a child who harms animals will grow up to be an adult who harms people, you can address that in a child early on and prevent the harm that happens against a person. But then the FBI kind of twisted that and used it as a way to catch people after the fact. And these psychological profiles of like a killer, but there's no preventative measure. And it just goes to the fact that our criminal legal system is built for revenge and not for actually preventing any crime. Most of the money that we put in is for catching someone after they've already did anything. We have no investment energetically or financially in understanding why people do what they do, why hurt people hurt other people, and why it's important to disrupt the cycle as early on as possible. And so we just churn out people who are just better at getting away with the harm, who watch the true crime shows thinking, oh yes, I just have to wear gloves next time. Like, we are not invested in figuring it out. And that's because people are afraid to empathize. Last one I'll offer is, like, I was listening to a podcast that was kind of talking about someone who was trying to prevent like pedophilic harm. And was saying that like people were just so afraid to be looked at as empathizing with a pedophile that they didn't even want to be a part of the initiative. When actually, if you care about children, you should want to prevent the harm, even if that means having to talk to someone who's done it before and understanding why and how we avoid it. And it's so backwards that we focus more of our attention on getting people after they've done it and setting up the registries, and not enough on.
You know why, right? Because if you dig deep enough you'll realize that at some level the government is at fault, right? There's something. There was a service. There was a situation. There was an environment in which, at its core, reason why people commit crime is because something was lacking in their life or their community that did not enable for them to grow up to be there, to reach their full potential in a way that was helpful to the community. Like uneducated kids, if you live in a community where there's rampant poverty and violence, and you go to a school that is not teaching you, the likelihood of you then going to either become incarcerated or commit a violent crime is pretty high, right? All because at the core of it, you were not provided what you needed to in order to be an active, productive, and participatory citizen within this country.
But that's also what's so interesting about abolition too, right? Is because abolition is asking us to like look at what harm is, and not just to look at what harm is, but to like look at all the ways that we are all complicit in systems of harm, right? Harm causing is systemic, right? Like, even when it's happening in your immediate community, there's some kind of system that's either responsible or is directly impacting the way that you're able to respond to harm, right? When we talk about abolition, we're not just talking about this like huge macro thing that like only relates to prisons, right? We're also talking about how we relate to each other in our own communities, right? Like if you believe in abolition or you're living in a world where you're trying to understand and commit to abolition, then when you see someone cause harm, right, even if it's emotional harm, your first impulse, right, may not necessarily, after learning about abolition, be then to like excommunicate this person. Obviously, there are some situations where like people might need to be distanced, right? Like for general safety, right? Especially when it's interpersonal violence. But at the same time, the idea that a person needs to be completely removed from the communities and sort of social networks that humanize them, like you start to think differently about whether or not that makes sense, right? And it's part of what I love about abolition is that we're asking people to think about how carceral systems are reproduced in their everyday lives and how we reproduce those systems too.
Yeah. I will say that has been the best part about abolition for me. It's been such an unfurling because you realize that like, okay, it's not enough to just point out and say, I don't want there to be police, but like, if I still want people to be safe, but I talk to people crazy. I have road rage. I'm instigating situations that might require mediation. It's made me so much more careful with my words. Like, be intentional, Bria. Don't just be, well, I said what I said. Like, no, I have to care about how what I say lands for other people and not be casual about stepping on people's triggers. I have to care about where I spend my money and whether those companies are aligned with me. And I have to care about whether I'm the kind of community member that my neighbor could call on if something was happening that they don't need 911. Because the amount of people who call 911 for a noise complaint because they saw something suspicious, like, call your neighbor. What? Yeah,
it's crazy.
It's because they don't know their neighbors, right?
Yeah,
We got actually in the divisiveness of individualism that we forget that the person down the street is our neighbor. Like, we should be able to go not just borrow a cup of sugar, but actually say, hey, yo, my kid is trying to sleep. Can you turn down the music a little bit? Yeah. But I'm going to stop us right there because we need to take a quick break. But I want to continue this conversation. So we will be right back on the other side of change.
Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punch!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
You are now back on the other side of change, only seen on the Black Star Network. We are back here with our guest and my co-host. And we were talking about like the division that we're seeing in communities. And I know, Kimon, you wanted to, tap into that conversation. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I always think it's so interesting when we start talking about individualism because we're implicitly and in some ways explicitly talking about capitalism, right? Yep. And I have this like perfect example. I live in a condo community and we have an HOA and the people who own the home above us they rent the apartment out. They do short-term rentals. So Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera, right? And when we first came to the condo and first came onto the HOA, we were like, hey, like, we're really not comfortable with that. Like, for many reasons, one of the obvious reasons being that like we live in a community of Black and brown people who aren't able to own homes. And so maybe we shouldn't be taking away more housing just for the purpose of spinning the block and making some money, right? So that said, there was an issue over the weekend where they had some guests who were extremely loud, kind of disruptive and destructive. They were obviously young people. They were kids having a party, right? Simple stuff. So we asked them to, check in with the guests and make sure that, they're not destroying anything, but also that like everything's okay, right? And we, first of all, it took forever to get in touch with them. And then when we finally did, we look out the window and the cops are outside.
Of course.
And our first impulse, my wife and I were just like, "What? Who called the fucking cops? Like, why would you call the cops? Like, this is your home, your second home or whatever else is around the corner. We're here. We're telling you that we're more than interested in going upstairs and talking to these young people. But before that is even offered to us, you call the police, right?" Mm-hmm. And the reality is that choice wouldn't have been made if that home wasn't a site for profit, right? Mm-hmm. If they actually lived in that home and cherished that home and cherished their communities, right, then their relationship to policing would ultimately be different. It wouldn't have felt appropriate to, at 11 p.m., call the cops on a bunch of kids who are having a party when you know that the police could show up and do some real harm to them, right? Yeah. So when I think about community and abolition and how many different things the conversation of abolition touches, right? We're not, again, just talking about prisons. We're not just talking about police. We're talking about modes of relationality and the ways that we exist with and for each other, right? And what I'm hoping that abolition does is that it continues to like break down those conflicts of relationality where we're able to actually tap in and think to ourselves, like, what do I actually want from my neighbor? Or like, I'm having a conflict. How do I actually resolve this in a way that keeps us all safe, right? And is resolution based, not just about like ending things so that we can continue making our money or continue business as usual, right? So anyway, that was just, yeah, I wanted to.
No, I'm glad you shared that story because it shows that sometimes even when we want a non-carceral response, the society around us is only built to be like, oh, you need something? Let me call 911.
Correct.
And it's like, wait a second. I actually just wanted a conversation. And why are we so, and it's actually, I mean, not to like broaden this conversation too much, but it's why I'm so afraid of where automation and AI is going, because we have less and less opportunities to talk to each other and realize like, wait a second, this other person is a human with the same desires and motivations and fears as me. I don't need to mobilize a police force against them when what I need is to have a respectful and like, you know, leveled conversation with that person. But it's just alarming to realize that, again, we don't have that imagination. We have been conditioned to depend on police and we outsource all of our needs to them. So last question for you, Kimon, but what I love is that your writing is something that kind of helps people to unfurl and unravel themselves and to realize that their needs may be different than what they thought they were, and their desires and their passions might also be different. I know you have a new project coming up that is going to have us thinking very differently about governance and how we depend on others to tell us what is okay. So tell us more about this project and anything else that folks can stay connected to you on.
Yeah, this project, Let the Poets Govern, it's ultimately about trying to identify the way that harm is reproduced and the way that not just harm, but white supremacy, subjugation of marginalized people, the way that has been reproduced through language, especially in our policies and in our governance at large, showing how that language gets reproduced and then the sort of poetics of that language, right? And when I say poetics, I mean almost easy to imagine, like the way that the idea of what is beautiful or what is poetic, like the way that we define how all of that stuff looks and what it looks like, right? So if we're talking about, you know, policies, when we're reading that language, like we understand it to be formal language, but we also understand it to be poetic, right? And so then like, what is the responsibility of that language if it is poetic language inherently? So it's a little complicated and again, in some ways abstract, but it all comes down to this question and conversation about abolition, right? How can we understand what it looks like to free our communities from the carceral state if we don't understand the kind of language that has shaped that state? So that's what Let the Poets Govern is trying to do. And it doesn't come out until next March. So I have plenty of time to figure out how to talk about this book. But I'm really excited to be able to contribute to the conversation in a way that is not prescriptive. Like, I don't want people to come away from that book and be like, Kimon told me what to do, and now I'm going to do it. I want people to come away from it and be like, oh, I'm thinking about this thing in a different way. And so now my understanding of what I can do, of what is possible is now more expansive. And that's tough. I think like writing any kind of book that is polemic or is trying to respond to the world as is, right? Like people want answers. They want to be told what to do. And to resist that, I think is like both radical and terrifying. So that's what I'm trying to do.
I love that so much.
Will get us there now. Being a little terrified oftentimes will get us closer to to where we need to be.
Yeah,
I don't mind
well,
that.
I'm real terrified. So hopefully,
and also you're in good company because all of the greats have also been in this place of, I'm not going to give you the answer. Number one, there is no one answer. I was just reading an Octavia Butler essay where she said that there's no magic bullet. There are thousands of answers at least, and you can be one of them if you choose to be, is what she said. So I'm excited for your book to be one of those thousands of answers.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I feel really honored. You're both so brilliant. Thank you for having me.
We love you.
Love you.
Well, listen, that is our episode. Check out Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, Beyond Policing by Philip McHarris. And you can also follow local abolitionist groups online, folks like @question.culture, Critical Resistance, and Movement for Black Lives. Until next time, keep reimagining the future. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok @FreckedWhileBlack. And my good sis, Jamira Burley, is @Jamira Burley on all platforms. See you on the other side.